episode came from a question my 13-year-old son asked me, a question I actually didn't have an answer for when he asked it. Last fall, I sat in my son's classroom for his back to school night, meeting with his science teacher and listening to an overview of the curriculum for the year. And my kids are not in a Christian school. So about halfway down the list, I saw the word evolution and I just perked up. Okay, so this year, my son's 7th grade class would be studying evolution. I remember saying to my son, wow, I'm so curious if they're going to approach evolution as a fact or a theory. And my son said, what do you mean? What's the problem with evolution? It was a genuine question on his part. He's been raised in our home where we talk from the perspective of a Christian worldview. He knows God created the world and everything in it. But what's the problem with evolution? He was asking for facts, not feelings. I realized I needed to arm myself and dove into a number of books trying to answer this question. Is the theory of evolution anti-God? Is there a difference between Darwinianism and evolution? These are the questions I want to pose to an expert. And I'm really excited to introduce you all to an incredible theologian and thinker, Dr. William Lane Craig. So Dr. Craig is a visiting scholar of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology and professor of philosophy at Houston Christian University. He has authored or edited over 30 books, including Theism, Atheism, and the Big Bang Cosmology, and over 100 articles in professional journals of philosophy and theology. In 2016, Dr. Craig was named by the Best Schools as one of the 50 most influential living philosophers. And here he is with us today. Hi, Dr. Craig.
Hi, Cynthia. Thank you for having me on the program.
I'm so excited to have you here. I would love, actually, if you could start by telling us a little bit about your own personal story. How did you come to know Jesus personally, and how did God lead you into this incredible life of teaching and writing?
Well, to make a long story short, I wasn't raised in a Christian home or even a church-going family, though it was a good and loving home. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And one day I walked into my high school German class and sat down behind a girl who was a radiant Christian. And I asked her, I said, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, it's because I'm saved. And I said, you're what? And she said, I know Jesus Christ as my personal savior. And I said, well, I've been going to church. And she said, well, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, it's because he really loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I had never heard the message of God's love before. And I went home that night and found a New Testament that had been given to me in the 5th grade by the Gideons when they visited our elementary school. And for the first time, I began to read it and was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And after about 6 months of the most intense soul searching I've ever been through, I yielded my life to Christ and totally gave my life to him as his disciple. And thereafter, graduating from high school, I went on to Wheaton College, a Christian college in the Chicago area. And the priceless gift that Wheaton gave me was the integration of my faith and learning. To understand that as a Christian, I didn't need to stick my brains in one pocket and my faith in the other pocket and never let them see the light of day at the same time. Instead, I could have a Christian perspective on the arts, on science, on history, on philosophy. And it was at Wheaton that I formed the vision of sharing the gospel in the context of giving an intellectual defense of the truth of the Christian faith. And that launched me on the ministry that I'm still engaged in today.
That's awesome. It seems like there's a lot of good things coming out of Wheaton College.
Yeah. Billy Graham, most notably.
My son is only 5 years away from college, so I will be on the hunt. We have some big topics we're going to talk about today. A lot of books are written about. My hope is to take these big topics and just give some clear, concise answers that the average mom can communicate to her kids. So, before we even begin to talk about evolution, I want to ask, what evidence is there that we live in a world created by God? I've learned that scholars call this a theistic universe.
Mhm.
Maybe you could start by defining a theistic universe versus a naturalistic universe. What does that mean?
Well, let's start with naturalism first. Naturalism is the view that all that exists is space time and its contents. Another word for naturalism is materialism or physicalism. That's all that exists. There are no supernatural realities. Theism is the opposite of atheism. Theism is the view that there is a transcendent, personal creator and designer of the universe who is the source of absolute moral goodness, called God. So, a theistic universe is a universe that is created and sustained by God. A naturalistic universe is a universe of matter and energy and nothing else.
And no purpose and no design.
Right, that would be an implication of naturalism. Since there is no transcendent creator and designer, the naturalistic universe just simply unfolds according to the laws of nature that govern it.
Awesome. So, I'd love to hear if you have examples from you of why we clearly live in a theistic universe or one created by God.
As a philosopher, I've specialized in various theistic arguments or arguments for the existence of God. Let me just list these briefly. One, I think that God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists rather than just nothing. Secondly, God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe at a point in the finite past. Thirdly, God is the best explanation for the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. Fourth, God is the best explanation for the fine tuning of the universe for intelligent life. Fifth, God is the best explanation for objective moral values and duties in the world. And finally, if God's existence is even logically possible, then it follows logically that God must exist. Now, that's just six of the many, many arguments for the existence of God that I've written on and defended in my philosophical work.
Would you mind giving a few examples of our finely tuned universe? Because that's something that I think
Mhm.
is interesting.
Yes. Fine tuning refers to the fact that when you express the laws of nature as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants like the gravitational constant or the cosmological constant. In addition to these constants, you also find in the laws of nature certain variables that stand for arbitrary quantities that are just put in at the beginning of the universe. For example, the amount of matter versus antimatter in the early universe, or the level of entropy or thermodynamic disorder at the beginning of the universe. And fine tuning means that the values of these constants and quantities fall into an extremely narrow life permitting range of values, such that if you were to alter these values by less than a hair's breadth, the balance would be destroyed and life could not exist anywhere in the universe. And so, over the last 50 years or so, scientists have just been stunned by the discovery of this fine tuning of the universe and are very exercised to find an explanation for it.
Could you give us maybe one or two fine tuned things? Like if it was different, we
Yes.
couldn't
Well,
exist.
I mentioned the gravitational constant. if the gravitational constant, that is the force of gravity, were altered by even 1 part out of 10 to the 60th power, the universe would not permit life. The cosmological constant is fine tuned to 1 part out of 10 to the 120th power. Now, these are just incomprehensible numbers, and you multiply them all together, and you find that the degree of fine tuning in the universe is simply beyond human comprehension.
And the cosmological, is that like how we are in relationship to the other planets around us?
The
Or
cosmological constant, Cynthia, refers to the force that drives the acceleration of the expansion of the universe. Scientists have known for many decades now that the universe is expanding. It's in a state of cosmic expansion. But what they've only discovered within the last 30 years or so is that this expansion is not slowing down as they previously thought, it's speeding up. It's actually accelerating. And the force that drives this acceleration is called the cosmological constant.
so like one thing I had heard like within that is like how close the earth is to the sun is so
Mhm.
specific that we're not too hot or not too cold. Is that true?
That is true, though. That's a different type of fine tuning than
Okay.
what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I'm talking about cosmological fine tuning, the fundamental parameters of the universe as a whole that were simply put in at the Big Bang as initial conditions. When you talk about things like the distance of the Earth from the sun, or our position in the galaxy, or the presence of Jupiter to act as a vacuum cleaner to prevent meteorites and asteroids from bombarding the Earth. Those are examples of fine tuning that are much, much, much later in the history of the universe, and not these cosmic initial conditions that are the subject of such intense discussion today.
Thank you. I think for me, like those sort of things I could picture help me, and those are things that I've mentioned to my son. Like, and
Mhm.
I don't know all the details. I leave that to people like you. But the sense that the balance of how our Earth sustains life is so finite. I found that interesting. That it's that scientists seem to think that even that shows that there must have been a creator behind us.
Well, this is especially true of the cosmic fine tuning. Unfortunately, these other examples tend to have been poisoned by the debate between creation and evolution in our public schools. And so biologists are not as open to the idea of a designer of the universe. But physicists are largely untainted by this creation evolution debate, because these cosmic conditions, you see, are prior to biological evolution. They're put in at the beginning, and therefore have nothing to do with the evolution of life. And indeed, the evolution of life would be impossible without these cosmic, fine tuned constants and quantities. So, this argument does a complete end run around the debate between creation and evolution by going right back to those cosmic initial conditions. And I think you can visualize these two. I mean, talk about the force of gravity. If the force of gravity had been slightly weaker, then the universe would have expanded too rapidly to ever form planets and stars. It would have just been a thin gas of particles. If the gravitational force had been a little bit stronger, then what happened is the contraction of the universe would have occurred, the expansion would have reversed, and the universe would have collapsed into a gigantic black hole from which it would never reemerge. So I think you can visualize in that way how important it is that gravity be exactly fine tuned to permit the existence and evolution of intelligent life anywhere in the cosmos.
All right, so we should talk about evolution because those are my big question. That's my
I
big
know.
question. All right, so um, Okay, so evolution. I've learned that we first have to define what we mean when we say evolution. I've heard different names thrown out: Darwinian, neo Darwinian evolution, theistic evolution. I'm sure there's many more. But could you briefly explain what the important difference is between these forms of evolution when they're discussed?
Well, you're quite right that the word evolution is a sort of accordion word that can be expanded or contracted at will. In its most general sense, evolution just means change over time. So, for example, you can speak of the evolution of human languages as English and German and Dutch have evolved over time. Biological evolution concerns the change over time of biological or living organisms. And the theory of evolution is that all of the living organisms that we see today didn't just pop into being finite times ago, but rather they are descended from common ancestors. That in the past, there were common ancestors that were quite different in many cases from the animals and plants that exist today. They have evolved or developed from these common ancestors with certain modifications.
Um, so if we're going to talk about then the difference between Darwinian evolution
Yeah.
and theistic evolution, can you define what's different
Yeah.
between those?
Now, what I gave was a definition of the word
Yeah.
evolution and biological evolution in general. There are theories of evolution to explain evolution. And Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in his book On the Origin of Species was that there are certain heritable traits that living organisms have. You inherit a lot of your traits from your parents and they from their parents. So there are heritable traits that living things have. And Darwin said that the reason that organisms are so well adapted to their environments is because the ones that are maladapted don't survive. They get weeded out by natural selection. That is to say, they don't manage to reproduce so that their properties or their traits are not inherited because they don't live and reproduce. The struggle for survival weeds out the maladapted organisms. So as a result, we see organisms today that are very well adapted to their environment. Now, that's Charles Darwin's original theory of evolution. Now, notice what Darwin did not explain. He tried to explain the survival of the fittest, but he didn't explain the arrival of the fittest. Where do those variations come from? And so Darwin's original theory has now been married with the genetic theory of Gregor Mendel, who discovered genetics and the basis of these heritable traits, namely that we have genes that code for things like eye color and hair color and height and size of your nose and all of these other sorts of traits. They're genetic. And so the neo Darwinian synthesis, that is to say, the modern synthesis of Darwinism with Mendel's genetic theory, says that these heritable traits arise by mutations in our genes. And these are often negative, they're deleterious. And so those organisms that have those kind of mutations get weeded out, they die off, as Darwin said. But sometimes a mutation will occur that will make the organism better adapted to its environment, especially if the environment changes. Say you have an ice age where it's cold. Well, then hairier organisms will tend to survive in the cold climate, and the ones that don't have thick fur will get killed off. And so the modern neo-Darwinian synthesis that you spoke of says that these heritable traits arise by mutations in our genes, And then Darwin's natural selection weeds out those that are not well adapted to the environment so that things change over time. And there are additional mechanisms that are also suggested. The theory has now been extended so that sometimes people talk about the extended evolutionary synthesis. But basically, those are the main tenets of the theory.
And then, thank you. And then, what's the difference then between Darwinian evolution and theistic evolution?
Theistic evolution would be a theistic interpretation of evolution, where the theist would say something like this: I think that God is the ultimate designer of evolution, that the whole evolutionary process described by Darwin and the neo Darwinian synthesis was the plan of God. It's God who is the ultimate cause of all of these things. So the theistic evolutionist isn't really proposing a different scientific theory. He's just saying that since we live in a theistic universe and we want to understand how God and evolution relate, evolution is the means that God uses to create different biological life forms here on Earth.
Awesome. Now, I've heard this specifically that Darwinian evolution is counter to Christianity. Do you think that's true?
No, I think that's completely false, Cynthia, and based on a misunderstanding. The reason that some people or theists or Christians reject Darwinian evolution is because these mutations in our genes that I spoke of are said to be random. And these theists or Christians rightly point out it's not random, it's under the providential control of God. God directs the evolutionary process. But this is based upon a misunderstanding of what evolutionary theorists mean by random. They do not mean that these things occur by chance or that they are undirected or blind. What they mean by random is that these mutations do not occur for the benefit of the host organism. Mutations are indifferent to whether or not they're good or bad for the host organism. And that's entirely compatible with theism. I mean, for example, suppose God caused a mutation in some organism because he wanted to make it easy prey for a predator. Well, God could do that, and then that mutation would have occurred for a reason. It's not just by chance, but it certainly wouldn't be for the benefit of the host organism. On the contrary, it's for the benefit of the predator. So by understanding how evolutionary biologists use the word random, I think you can see that it is not at all incompatible with design or purpose or intent.
I guess what I had heard is that at its core, Darwinian evolution is materialistic. And so that's why it would be counter to Christianity.
Yeah, that again is a mistake. Naturalism, remember we talked about earlier in the program, naturalism is a philosophical theory, not a scientific theory. Now, the word naturalist is sometimes used of certain scientists who study the natural world. For example, you could say that Charles Darwin was a very accomplished naturalist because he studied plants and animals and traveled around the world collecting specimens and so forth. In that scientific sense of being a naturalist, there are many Christians who are naturalists. But naturalism as a philosophical position is the view that there is no God, that there are no supernatural entities, that everything is just material, matter in motion. And that's not part of the scientific theory of Darwinism. Darwinism has nothing to say about whether or not there's a God or whether or not he created the universe or is the source of moral values. All it says is that we have these genes that mutate without a view toward the benefit they confer on the host organism, and that those mutations that are deleterious cause those organisms not to reproduce, but to get weeded out and to die off. Uh, and that's all. And therefore, organisms change over time as the environmental conditions and pressures change. And that's it.
Okay, so
So,
it's
basically, what I'm saying, Cynthia, is your son was right in the question he asked you. There's nothing wrong with evolution theologically. What's wrong is naturalism. And it's very important that we, as Christian parents, be able to give our children solid reasons to believe in God, like those 6 reasons I mentioned earlier, so that they won't be seduced by naturalism.
correct. And I think that's sort of what I was trying to maybe get at. I had, I
Mhm.
guess, understood that people who espouse Darwinianism are also espousing naturalism, that they connect those two. And so you're saying I'm not necessarily correct on that.
No, I think that's not true. That not only are there Christian evolutionists, but even many non-Christian evolutionists are theists. In fact, I've even seen claims that most of them are theists, that they believe in some sort of God, um, but they're not
Absolutely. And
creationists.
and that's I think where I was going. I guess I had just heard there was a difference between Darwinian evolution and theistic evolution in the sense that Darwinian was materialistic, believing that origin came from
Yeah.
random chance and that theistic came from God. And so you're
No,
saying no.
that's just not true. As I say, Darwinism, or not Darwinism, but the evolutionary biology is theologically neutral. It just doesn't speak to those issues. Theistic evolution is a philosophical or theological position about the theory of evolution, saying that God has elected to use evolution as his means of creating life on this planet.
Okay, I'm going to keep, thank you for that clarification. I'm going to keep charging ahead so I can be, because I want to value your time. Okay, I've heard though that it's important to call evolution a theory and not a fact. Is that true?
That's also incorrect. Um, it is a theory in the same sense that Einstein's special theory of relativity is a theory, or that his general theory of relativity is a theory. That is to say, it is a complex explanation of the physical world. And just as those theories have an enormous amount of data confirming them, so there's an enormous amount of data also confirming evolutionary theory. So one can choose to disagree with the theory or not. That's certainly right. Science is always provisional, but I don't think it's helpful to try to make this dichotomy between fact and theory, because some theories are so well established that they are virtually facts.
Okay, so let me ask you, what are the problems, if any, with materialistic evolution?
Okay. Um, the problems with it lie in its materialism more than in its evolution.
Yeah.
Namely, there's no good reason to think that materialism is true. And there are great arguments to think that materialism is false, like the 6 that I mentioned earlier. Now, if we want to talk about some of the problems with the theory of evolution, there are 2 components of that one needs to examine scientifically. One is called the thesis of common ancestry, which is to say that all life on Earth has descended from a unique common ancestor that lived a few billion years ago. And that is not proven. I think that most of us would not balk at saying that there are common ancestors for many things that we observe today. For example, it's not implausible, I think, that um, say cows and horses should have a common ancestor at some point in the distant past, or even that, um, say, whales and dolphins have common ancestors in the past. But to say that there's a common ancestor for everything alive today is a sweeping, sweeping claim that I think does go beyond um, the evidence. Um, it's one thing to say that a horse and a cow have a common ancestor. It's quite another to say that a horse and a sponge have a common ancestor, or even more radically, that a horse and a banana are descended from a common ancestor. And that is what the thesis of common ancestry asserts. So this is a radical claim that I think one can be justifiably incredulous of and skeptical of unless one has really overwhelming evidence for common ancestry. Now, evolutionary biologists will tell you that there is overwhelming evidence for common ancestry, and that therefore your incredulity should be overcome. But I'm not yet convinced. The other part of evolutionary theory would be the explanatory mechanisms. What explains the evolution of all of these forms of life and all their complexity and diversity from that common ancestor? And the question here is, are the mechanisms of genetic mutations selected by natural selection sufficient to explain the uh, degree and the breadth of biological complexity that we observe today? Could it have actually evolved due to those mechanisms in the time available? And again, on that score, I think there's plenty of room for skepticism about that. So scientifically, the theory of evolution, I think, can be challenged either with respect to the claim of common ancestry or with respect to the explanatory mechanisms of random mutation and natural selection.
So the issue is not that animals change, that we see that, right? And that they,
Right. We all agree with that.
yes, the issue is, did they come from a common ancestor? And is that something that can be scientifically proven? Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, that's right. Did they all come from a common ancestor at some distant point in the past? And if they did, is that explained by genetic mutation and natural selection?
So someone coming from a theistic worldview would say that yes, we
Mhm.
see that there's evolution in the sense that animals, plants, we change according to our environment, but we
Yes.
believe that the origin came from God, and that probably there were many things that were created. As you said, it's hard to think of a whale and a cow coming from a common ancestor.
Mhm.
So, am I correct in that?
Um, a theist can take at least two different perspectives
Okay.
on this. If he's not a theistic evolutionist, I mean, he could be a theistic evolutionist,
Yeah.
but let's assume that he's skeptical of either the explanatory mechanisms or he's skeptical of the thesis of common ancestry. The creationist will say that God has intervened in the historical process at certain points along the way to create new forms that don't have ancestors. They are not descendants from ancestors, rather, they were specially created by God. So the creationist imagines miraculous interventions of God to create certain plants and animals and other organisms. Um, I think that the most plausible form of creationism would be a sort of progressive creationism, where this didn't all just happen at the beginning, but that over the eons, God has periodically intervened miraculously in the evolutionary process to bring about things that wouldn't have resulted had he not intervened. That would be progressive creationism. But another view that I think also works is to say that the evolutionary process is under the providential direction of God, so that he doesn't need to intervene miraculously in the process, but rather he supervises or superintends the process so that just those mutations occur that he knew would be advantageous in the struggle for survival and would over time eventually lead to humanity on this planet. And that would be a non-creationist view. Maybe you could call it supervisionist, that God supervises the evolutionary process. And he might even intervene to cause mutations, say. He wouldn't create horses and cats out of nothing, but he might cause critical mutations along the way that would then issue in new life forms. So those would be a couple of different ways of looking at it from a Christian perspective.
And I think sort of the big takeaway is that we don't have to be afraid of diving into these topics and seeing them from a theistic perspective, that that shouldn't be scary, I guess.
Exactly. That's what I want to communicate to your viewers today, Cythnia, is that we as Christians need to get beyond the boogeyman of evolutionary biology and understand that as a scientific theory, it is neither incompatible with belief in God, nor is it incompatible with the Bible properly interpreted. And therefore, there's nothing to fear here, and we can follow the evidence where it leads.
So the only incompatible piece from a Christian perspective would be that God was not involved, that it just happened out of nothing randomly.
Well, but again, that isn't the theory.
Right.
The theory of biological evolution doesn't say that it happened without God. It doesn't say that. And it doesn't say that they hand them randomly in the sense of just by chance or undirected. Again, random means that these mutations do not occur for the benefit of the host organism. Many of them are deleterious.
Okay.
So it's neutral.
I think I'm following you.
Okay.
Okay. So I know one significant issue is that we as humans all have an inherent moral code. Why is that? Why could that be a problem from a materialistic evolutionary perspective?
Mm-hmm. The problem here again would be not the evolution, it would be the materialism. Because on materialism, we are just basically bags of chemicals on bones. And moral values would be simply the byproducts of sociobiological evolution. Just as a troop of baboons will exhibit altruistic behavior because it's helpful in the struggle for survival, so Homo sapiens has developed a sort of herd morality that helps to perpetuate our species in the struggle for survival. But there's nothing about this morality that makes it objectively true. On a materialistic perspective, we're just animals, and animals have no moral duties to one another. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. When a great white shark copulates forcibly with a female, it copulates forcibly with her, but it doesn't rape her, because none of these things is forbidden. They have no moral dimension. And so if there is no God, if materialism is true, then there really are no objective moral values and duties. Everything becomes relative and subjective.
So I've heard that one thing that's common among people is that we all do have the same inherent moral code, that we all see the violations, the killing is wrong, that taking someone else's stuff is wrong, that sleeping with a neighbor's wife is wrong, that because we all have this same inherent moral code, and obviously there's our, lunatics throughout history, who
Sure.
do their own thing, but in general have the same inherent moral code that itself testifies to being created in God's image.
That would be one argument, and I think that from what I've read, that is what anthropologists tell us. Anthropologists say that there is across all cultures and societies a kind of common moral code that can come to expression in different ways in different societies. So, for example, modesty would be a common value, but what is considered immodest will vary from culture to culture, but there is still that underlying value. So that may be true, but I personally think the moral argument is even stronger than that, Cynthia, without appealing to the sort of commonality of moral values among mankind. I would just ask each of us to look inside of himself and say, do you think that raping a little child is a morally indifferent act? Or is that something that is morally wrong to do? And I think that unless you are, as you say, pathological, you'll recognize that, yes, there's a difference between good and evil that is real and objective.
And that, would you say that is one thing that connects us to the creator then, that sense of a moral
Yes.
code?
Remember, I think my fifth argument for the existence of God is that God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. And the argument would go like this. Premise one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Two, objective moral values and duties do exist, from which it follows logically. Three, therefore God exists. So I think there's a really great moral argument for the existence of God based upon our moral experience of the moral value of human beings and of our moral obligations toward them.
Good. Thank you. So, and the problem with, and again, I'm just making sure my brain is getting around it, which is why I'm reiterating.
Yeah.
The problem with materialism is that it says that we are without purpose or design, and that we just function like, almost randomly. That we don't have any free will, that we just respond to the chemicals in our bodies and in our brains in all that we do.
Yes, that's an implication of naturalism. You see, if naturalism is true, if materialism is true, then there is no soul or mind that has freedom of the will. Our brain states are simply determined by prior brain states and the input of sensory information through our five senses. And so there is no freedom of the will. Everything is determined. And that, of course, makes morally worthwhile actions impossible, because then making a moral decision is just like a tree growing a branch. It has no moral dimension at all. So I do think that the implications of naturalism are truly, truly horrifying if you think them through. It means there is no free will, no more moral values that are objective. We never really think about things. There is no moral causation. We're just machines, as Richard Dawkins has put it, for propagating DNA. That's our sole purpose for being.
Thank you. This has been a lot, and this has been good. My last two questions for you simply are, one, if a mom wanted to dive deeper into these topics, do you have any recommendations, either books she would read herself or that she might even read with her kids? Any direction you would give would be great.
Yeah, I'm afraid that most of the books that I'm aware of on evolutionary theory are so complex and difficult that
Yeah.
you need to be a university student to understand them. But a couple of books that you might look at would be John Lennox's book, 7 Days That Divide the World. John Lennox, 7 Days That Divide the World, or a book by Steve Meyer called Explore Evolution, which lays out the arguments for evolution and the arguments against evolution. So, Steve Meyer, Explore Evolution, that would be a resource. More fundamentally, if you're interested in arguments for the existence of God to show we live in a theistic universe, go to our website, reasonablefaith.org, and look at the animated videos that we have developed on each of those 6 arguments for God's existence that I mentioned at the beginning of our podcast. And these animated videos are short, only about 5 minutes long. They are very entertaining, very informative, and will give you a solid foundation in being able to share why you think we live in a theistic universe, a universe created by God.
That's fun. I'm totally going to go look for those videos. Okay, last question. Do you just have any last words of wisdom or encouragement for any moms that would be listening?
Well, I think that moms need to encourage their husbands to be involved in the education and preparation of their children. It's one thing for mom to go to church and take the kids to Sunday school, but it's if they see that dad is committed to Christ and believes this stuff and lives it out and tries to teach it to them, that will help them to persevere in their faith like nothing before. Now, I understand that for many moms, it's difficult because their husbands have abdicated their God-given role to bring up their children in the nurture and instruction of the Lord. But if there's anything you can do to try to encourage your husband to get involved and take this role, I would urge you to do so, because that is the best way to bring up your children to have a solidly based Christian faith that they will not abandon when they go to high school and university.
Amen. Thank you for that word. That was good. Well, thank you, Dr. Craig. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. Thank you for diving into these big topics. Thank you for just being a resource and a scholar. I really appreciate that. So
You're
thank
welcome.
you.